Alright, class, we're going to get started on chapter 11, and it is the third and final chapter in the political frame. It's entitled Organizations as Political Arenas and Political Agents. We're going to get into what constitutes a political arena, what constitutes how the agents within that arena work. We're going to extend a metaphor to help understand the political frame, and hopefully tie everything together a little bit with the way in which organizations exist both in these ecosystems and how these ecosystems are at best interacted with, but at worst the organization itself is more controlled by them than controls them. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So what exactly are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about organizations as arenas. We're going to talk about how organizations are political agents onto themselves. We're going to talk a little bit about ecosystems. Then we're going to talk about how external control of organizations really occurs. So let's start out with the idea of organizations as arenas. Whenever I say organization as arena, I'm using the idea of them being a stage of sort, them being a place where a clash happens. Think about the traditional gladiatorial arenas. What you're thinking of is two warriors step in, one warrior steps out. Well, everything that we've learned from Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 is that the competition over scarce resources occurs constantly within organizations, and that conflict means that the organization itself plays home to that battleground between alliances, allegiances of some sort, between the coexisting factions that make up one side and another. So let's think critically about what do arenas really do. The first thing is that they establish the rules of the game. There are certain things that are allowed in one arena that aren't allowed in the next. Let's keep using the combat analogy for a moment. If you're thinking about different arenas for a combat sport, you have boxing, in which you're allowed to use fists with a certain padded weight glove. An alternative or a step toward a different arena would be kickboxing, in which kicking and punching is legal. However, if you take another step and you go into a pure mixed martial arts arena, then that means that takedowns, grappling, punching, and kicking are all legal. So literally the rules of the game, what the combatants are allowed to do, change on the basis of arena in combat sports. We'll extend that analogy here to organizations by saying certain organizations let you play dirtier than others. They let things be dictated within the organization more. They have more fluid rules for what can and cannot happen within an organization. Think about the graduate schools that I talked about in the previous chapter when I mentioned that there were certain groups, so alliances, members who were students of these organizations, who were literally trying to make it harder on one another by trying to take the learning materials away from others so that they would be able to succeed and others would be able to fail. I told you how in a self-regulating system, or when the arena shaped the rules by saying that those people would be socially censured if they did that sort of thing. That's an example of how arenas shape the rules in the same way that the chosen combat arena dictates what the fighters are allowed to do and not to do. So too does the arena of the organization, or the way that the organization conducts itself and allows people within it to conduct itself, shape the way that the conflict competition occurs within that as legitimate, illegitimate, acceptable, or unacceptable. It also recognizes that arenas change the players and the stakes. Whenever I say they change the players, some organizations are more democratic, some are more autocratic. If we go all the way back to the structural frame and lay it on top of the political frame here, in a democratic organization, obviously the players are more diverse, they have more power, the capability of somebody to build alliances of the people who are still at their same level within the organization hierarchically, that creates players, people who are trying to manipulate the arena to get the slim resources that are constantly at stake to be in their favor. It also changes the stakes. Whenever I talk about the stakes, what I mean is it changes what you can and can't do. In the opposite of what we just talked about from the democratic perspective, in an autocratic organization, the stakes are always higher for scarce resources because you have little control over them. What you're competing for might be the attention, the favor of those who are in control and making decisions. And that means that the rules of the game change as well. Let's take two diametrically opposed situations and imagine how they manipulate these three factors as an arena for an organization. If you had a highly democratic organization in which a bunch of different members were vying for who would be the head of this particular organization. It's a union within the organization. The stakes were high because that leader would get to represent them. They would get to change the course and trajectory of the organization. They have a big stake in that. Alternatively, in an autocratic organization where the individual players might not have a tremendous amount of control on their day-to-day life, the rules of the game are changed to who can, perhaps Brown knows the best from a negative perspective, but who can negotiate a positive relationship using interpersonal skills in order to gain favor with, in order to make a connection with the people who are in control, in order to better their position. So the stakes might be a little bit higher even in that autocratic organization, because unlike the democratic situation, your ability to influence is small. Stakes are relative, so it's hard to say which one is more important or less important, but you can see how each side completely manipulates the way that the conflict happens, and that's how organizations are both arenas, and that these arenas shape how things happen. Think about bottom-up political organization. Labor unions and civil rights movements are themselves connected to the arenas within which they happen. I'm going to tie this into ecosystems that we'll get to later, so let's come back to that idea after we go forward a little bit. First, organizations as political agents. So organizations exist in ecosystems. So what's an ecosystem? You can think about it as an organizational field in which competitors and allies co-evolve. Co-evolve is an interesting idea. You have to realize that for every action that you take and every time that you improve as an organization, your competitors could be doing the same thing. They could be evolving in a stronger and more powerful way. If you take, for example, the idea of rental systems versus streaming video. The difficulty was that, sure, you had streaming systems versus rental systems in which competitors were co-evolving. And clearly the streaming systems were evolving much faster and providing a better service. However, there were also the co-evolution of competitors within that very same ecosystem or organizational field. So you had Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime. These were different streaming services. So it's not just the big two that were competitors, but it's not as though everyone who does the same thing is allied in any way. So an ecosystem is a way of understanding organizational conflict or how organizations exist in the political arena to say that they interact with a bunch of different moving parts. Now, organizations exist in ecosystems too. Recognize that organizations depend on the environment around them for resources and support. Every consumer-based organization requires consumers. It requires people with expendable cash who want to spend that money on their good or service, and they cease to exist or cease to manufacture the good in question if they don't have people who want to buy it anymore or want to buy it somewhere else. So extending that ecosystem analogy to this section as how organizations exist in ecosystems, whenever we stopped wanting to rent videos at Blockbuster, Blockbuster Video went out of business because they relied on a consumer base that was simply no longer there anymore. So organizations need the skills of politicians. Remember that we define the skills that a political manager has as developing agendas, mapping environments, as creating relationships and allies and competitors. Why? Because when you think about organizations as political agents that exist in an ecosystem, you can rely on allies that you build through mergers, through acquisitions, through trade connections. One of the strengths early on of Walmart, before it became a ubiquitous department store, was that it had really good relationships with a lot of its trading partners who would use their trucking system and transportation system as a piggyback. They would be a place that they could be a distribution hub, so that as a political agent onto themselves, they relied on an ecosystem of inputs as a department store to sell off excess goods. Well, that was a way in which they were able to cohabitate, to make connections with, to co-evolve with those people that were actually their allies. And so that's how you see the ecosystem analogy extend in a different way, in which organizations exist in an ecosystem. Also, I want to extend the idea of ecosystems so you have a better viewpoint on them, as think about society as its own ecosystem. You have the business realm, you have the public realm, you have the governmental realm. Constantly what these ecosystems are trying to understand about each other and how they interact is what should be the power relationship between these organizations and society. What right does the government have to infringe its authority upon the public? How much can they regulate business? How much should business be free of governmental regulation? How much should business have to take into consideration the public account? You see how these pieces fit together, and we'll use a case study to be able to test this idea. In a situation where businesses do not need to be accountable to the public good, or were free of government regulation, you might imagine that businesses that pumped lead into the water in Flint, Michigan would not be accountable to the public, and because the government did not regulate that or prevent that in any way, then they would have, existing onto themselves, made more money by not spending the requisite cash or capital or scarce resource to filter the lead out in the first place and to not dump it into the water. However, you recognize that that's silly. That's not how that situation took place. Why? Because the government and the public do hold businesses accountable, because they exist in a cohabitated ecosystem where no action is going to be unnoticed by the other pieces within that ecosystem. It's the same idea as the food web, if you want to extend that metaphor, that if you lose a species in the food chain, then it affects all other members, because even small creatures feed other organisms, and those organisms chain out so that you get a ripple effect. Well, here in Flint, Michigan, when we're talking about the business pollution of lead, it ended up affecting the public in a massive way. It's created horrific health risks for the people who drank that water, who then go to the government to look for social sanction, to look for protection, to look for recompense or reparation from the business, to try to take back something that has been taken from them, to get retribution of some sort, to get justice in some way. So that's how all things exist within an ecosystem. Organizations are the exact same. Let's go back to where I said we would go back to now, when we talk about labor unions and civil rights movements. Labor unions and civil rights movements respond to or react to conditions that are being imposed upon them externally. And that's either in the labor unions situation, you talk about the external provocation of how they're treated for labor hours. And I went into this in other chapters, so I won't belabor that point. But from civil rights movements, are people treated equitably within the society? Coming down here to the ecosystem, from the public perspective, is everyone getting equal access to the government, or are they being treated fairly in business? When you see hiring practices being changed, things like affirmative action are an example of a civil rights movement responding to inequitable practices from the business world in which the public enforces a rule through government that they would like to see changed and imposed upon businesses, and those businesses then have to follow that particular regulation. Inversely, when you're talking about labor unions, there's good and bad parts of them. You can understand that the labor union gains enough power to influence the public to force businesses to have people join their labor union to be a part of their business, whether they like it or not, so that they pay those dues. And now what you've seen across the nation is that some businesses are starting to go forward with some of the minority support who didn't want to join the unions in the first place from the public to petition the government to say that isn't right, that we should have to join a union and pay dues if we don't want to take part in that particular union because we don't think that it benefits us. So you see how organizations are instruments of market tyranny in some eyes, depending upon which which position you take, which viewpoint you tend to approach it from. And you have to ask yourself the question, are they largely shaped by, or are they largely shaped from, social and economic forces? You see that organizations, because they exist in an ecosystem of their own and are interacted with by all these different forces, even something as small as a fraternity or sorority on campus interacts with that particular university, interacts with its national chapter and identity. If there's a scandal that exists in one chapter in one place in the country, it can affect the entire national fraternity or sorority's reputation. And therefore you see that these political organizations, these agents that they themselves are represented through the organization, have a stake in all of these different connections that they have with alliances and also competitors in order to better their namesake, their reputation. Everything that you do matters within an ecosystem to affect other things up and down the chain of command. So the external control of organizations is theorized to explain how organizations are externally provoked rather than internally driven. The gist of what it says is that organizations are more reactive than proactive. They're controlled by external forces within the environment. They're often other-directed. You react to a need in the consumer base. You don't typically create the consumer base with which you respond to. You confront conflicting demands from multiple constituencies. So you react to a niche in the market that's not being handled, that's not being connected with, that is available for you to provide services to. An organization's understanding of the environment is often distorted and imperfect. So let's take an example here to test this idea that their organizations are other-directed in some capacity. And to say that if you look at the streaming services example that I said, you're looking at Netflix, you're looking at Hulu, and you're looking at Amazon Prime. We're going to choose 3 representative examples of streaming services. How are these organizations other-directed? Well, they've carved out their niche from conflicting demands from multiple constituencies. You've got different consumers who want different things. With Hulu versus Netflix or Amazon Prime, you have a more direct competition because they've carved out their niche as being much more related to television programs than to movies. With Netflix and Amazon Prime, they focus a lot more on movies, but also television shows. And recently, there have been deviations where you see that Amazon Prime is making connections with HBO and some traditional paid programming from cable, and that helps them to carve out a niche from constituencies who wanted those programs but don't have things like HBO Go, connected to or an account with HBO. So here you've got 3 different services that all provide virtually the same thing. You stream entertainment from them. However, each of them have responded to external environmental pressures and competition amongst the 3 to find entire identities that allow them to create a consumer base for themselves in which the external control of the organization really does fall on the members. What are you willing to pay for? Which one will you subscribe to more? Why do you choose one over the other? So what you see is that organizations, when they become reflexive to the consumer, lose some of their autonomy or ability to make their own decisions, but they gain from that. So by giving up some of their personal autonomy as an agent, a political agent of sorts, they find that by giving in, they actually are rewarded with more of the scarce resource and capital that they're looking for. Now, a lot of this has been highly theoretical, and this ties everything together from the political frame by explaining that we talked about a lot of the nuts and bolts stuff in Chapter 10. This is much more highly theoretical to understand how arenas and ecosystems are ways in which the political struggle within organizations is constantly affecting other parts outside of the organization. What I like about it from a theoretical standpoint is it ties together the external and the internal in really interesting ways and shows how things have an incredible ripple effect to connect with how others view you, how you carve your niche in an organization, and most importantly, how organizations must be responsive to the constituencies that represent their divided interests. If I were doing a response paper on this particular chapter, I might delve into a particular organization and explain it within its given ecosystem or organizational field. What connections do you see from a hierarchical perspective or from a co-habitual relationship? A second one that I might start to think about is, excuse me, what organizations do you think best fall under the idea of arenas? How do they act as political agents? Are there ways in which organizations are powerful in general politics? For example, when organizations reach certain plateaus of power, do they themselves become lobbying agents for their interest? If so, how? If not, why not? I think those are probably the papers that I would write if I were in your position. But I've been enjoying a lot of the response papers that I've read, so I'll also leave it open-ended. A lot of you have not necessarily taken my offers at the end of these lectures for what I think response papers should be, and you've written through your own interpretation some very interesting responses. So I'd advise you to keep going down that path. I offer suggestions, but by no means an exhaustive set, and hopefully only a point for you to jump off from. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know on email, and I'd be happy to respond to you to explain a little bit more of the chapter to help you push along. I hope now that you've completed the first test and we're entering into the next unit that you have had no difficulty up to this point, and I look forward to starting the next of the frames of analysis for the chapter.